Hello, my friends. Happy Friday, and welcome to Organic Office Hours, my recurring, if not always predictable, session where I answer real questions from real marketing leaders about this wild world of SEO, AEO, GEO that we find ourselves within these days. My name is Tyler. I run Optimist, which is an organic growth consulting firm for B2B tech and SaaS. I have spent the last 10 years building SEO, AEO, and GEO growth strategies for clients ranging from seed and Series A all the way through enterprise companies. Um, and so the whole point of these sessions is I try to answer like the real questions that I'm uh, coming up against in conversations that I'm having with prospects, with current clients, with friends, other folks in the industry. And I just try to create clarity. I mean, I think right now, especially, we're just in a time where there's still so much confusion. There's a lot of conflicting information and evidence. Um, I'm not gonna proclaim to be the number one expert on AEO and GEO, but I have spent 2 to 3 years or so really digging in with our clients, understanding what works, seeing a lot of nuance, and of course studying a lot of the things that have been shared around the web and by other folks in the space. And so my goal is to just try to share as much information as I can with you. And a big part of that is your questions. Okay, so first and foremost, if you've already sent me some questions or popped some questions into the comments, I really appreciate that. We're going to get to some of those today. Secondly, if you have not already done that, if you haven't sent me your questions, please do so. Either drop them in the comments here on this live stream, send me a DM, shoot me an email, send me a carrier pigeon, whatever whatever mode of communication you prefer. I'd love to hear your questions. No question too big, no question too small. I totally stole that from PJ Vote. Sorry about that, PJ. But yeah, I'd love to answer your questions. So please send those my way. And yeah, thanks so much for being here. Let's kick things off. Um, so today I think we have four total questions that we're going to dig into. So let me jump right in. Okay, so the first question that we have is one of our friends, hopefully in the audience. I am probably going to get your name wrong, so apologies in advance on the pronunciation here. I'm going to go with Mare, is my guess here. Mare asked a question about solopreneurs. So Mare is the founder of the SaaS Founders Club. So presumably he interacts with a lot of solopreneurs, solo founders who are building SaaS businesses. And so he asks, basically his question was, with SEO, there was kind of a clear roadmap, and you can kind of follow the steps and sort of build your SEO over time. But with AEO, it's perhaps less clear. And so he says, let's say I already have a homepage and a few landing pages. What comes next? Do you just focus on more content? Do you build comparison pages? Do you focus on external mentions, reviews, something else? I'll say, first of all, this is indicative of probably the number one question that I get from prospects and from our clients, which is about prioritization. Okay, that's probably the biggest value add that I can possibly add as a consultant and as an advisor with our clients is uh, what do I do now? What do I do next? And what does my roadmap look like over time? Because what sort of happened with AEO is that we've had sort of this explosion of things that you could do, factors that could matter, right? There are a lot of these sort of could, should, might kind of things that are floating around. And so, really, a big part of the work that we do is helping sort of untangle that, figure out all the moves that we can make, figure out exactly where your business is right now and what you need and what's going to be the highest impact next step. And then what's that roadmap look like for the next month, for the next 6 months, for the next 12 months? Because it's going to be different for every company. I think this is actually going to end up being a recurring theme on today's session. But the reality is that it sort of depends on where your business is at right now. We'll get into that a little bit more here in some of the future questions here. But there's no one starting point for every company that's going to work in every single case. And that's also one of the reasons why, the way that we do AEO, the way that we work with clients is, it's not sort of AEO by the pound, if you will. Like we're not just selling a package of, you get X blog posts and Y links and Z Reddit mentions or whatever. because that's not the right fit for every company. And it really depends on where you're at and what you need. Okay, stepping off the soapbox, answering Mayor's question here. The rough priority order that generally tends to work, and basically you kind of start at phase one and sort of depending on where you're at and how mature you are in each of these phases, you kind of move to the next stage. So the key things that I would focus on, number one, is like on-site factors. So any kind of technical things, just like SEO, right? If there's like a barrier to your website getting crawled or indexed or anything like that, that's always fixed. Number one, it doesn't matter how much time and effort you spend creating content or nailing down your positioning or whatever it is. If your site's not accessible from a technical perspective, we've got to address that first and foremost. Number two, brand and messaging consistency. So this is another big one, and this is sort of one of those things where this is sort of the proof, in my opinion, of like how AEO is fundamentally different in many ways from SEO, which is that LLMs are synthesizing information about your business from a variety of sources. The good news is that you control a huge portion of those, right? You control your website, you control your G2 or your Capterra pages or whatever sort of the rankings pages that you have. You control your social profiles. You control any other like third party profile or page that you own and set up for your brand. And so making sure that your brand and messaging are consistent across all of those surfaces is a huge unlock for a lot of companies, because the reality is that many many companies are very out of sync on these different properties. They're saying very different things about what their business is, what their product does, how it helps, who it helps. All of these things are very wildly out of alignment in many cases. A lot of the sites that I see, the companies that I work with, that's one of the key first things that we try to clean up is like, let's make sure that the LLMs have a very clear signal. We are X company, we do Y for Z people to solve this specific set of problems. The clearer that messaging, that brand, and the more consistent it is, the more likely it is to then sort of make its way into the LLM responses. Number two, I would say, or number three, I guess, on the list here is positioning content. So Mayor asked specifically about like comparison pages, that kind of stuff. Yes, I think that is really valuable. We'll talk a little bit about the listicles debate here in just a moment, but positioning content is very important and valuable, right? Because again, when you think about how LLMs work, what they're ultimately trying to do here is synthesize information across a bunch of different sources and turn it into one cohesive and coherent response. And so, a big part of that, especially in like a commercial discovery type of conversation that might be happening in ChatGPT, let's say, uh, is the user is asking questions about how one solution compares to another. They're asking for a list of potential solutions in which ChatGPT is sort of synthesizing pros and cons, et cetera, et cetera. And so having clear positioning content essentially gives you at least an opportunity to control that narrative. So you can say, hey, we have these features, our competitors don't, or this is these are the types of customers that we serve, whereas competitor Y serves this other set of customers. Having some control over that narrative can be extremely valuable, and again, especially in those like high impact, high value commercial discovery, competitor comparison types of conversations within LLMs. So creating a sort of a bank, if you will, or a library perhaps of positioning content, and that can take many forms. Yes, it can be a listicle. Yes, it can be an X versus Y comparison. It can also be like a category kind of comparison or explainer, right? Hey, we operate in this category. Here's how this category is different from that category. Here's why you, a solo SaaS founder, want to look for a solution within this category rather than that category, right? So uh, positioning content is really important here, but it doesn't have to just be like a head-to-head X versus Y. It can take a lot of different forms, and it really depends on how your buyers are shopping, what types of searches and prompts they're using to conduct commercial discovery and investigation and comparison. And then the last thing that I'll say here is that in most cases, there's like a long tail of targeted content that you want to and should create. Um, this is very honestly very similar to kind of the roadmap of like from like an SEO perspective, where we're essentially trying to create a library of content that associates us, our brand, our product, our service with the topics that are most relevant to us, and the topics in which we should be sort of in the narrative, if you will. Aja Frost, hopefully I'm getting that name correct, from HubSpot just recently did an interview with Ross from Siege. Shout out to all those folks. And she talked about this idea of like tofu with a twist, which I really like, which is, basically the idea is like the old version of like, we're going to create a tofu article about, what is, I don't know, what is invoice processing or whatever, right? Some kind of like very tofu type of content, and we're going to use that to kind of attract traffic. That strategy doesn't really work in the AI era. Most of that traffic is going to get hoovered up by AI overviews. It's not really helping your brand from an AI perspective because you're just sort of feeding content in, but you're not making any kind of connection between the topic or the problem, let's say, and your actual product, right? So most of that content that's been written over the last 10 years for like an SEO lens has been sort of tofu in a silo, if you will, right? It's like, hey, we're just trying to get people to the website. We're not really pitching our product here. We're just trying to kind of attract traffic. I think that's the trap, right? That's the old trap. I think it was a trap then, but it's especially a trap now. And so instead, what we want to think about is this idea. Again, Aja calls it tofu with a twist. We refer to it as problem anchoring, or sometimes we talk about narrative clarity. The idea here is that if you're going to write, like, for example, a top of the funnel article, first and foremost, you should frame that from the perspective of an actual problem or a pain point, not just like a broad what is procurement, but more specifically like, how do I speed up my procurement process, or how do I automate my procurement, whatever, sort of the actual problems or pain points are that people are trying to address, and that your product or business solves. Okay, so look at this sort of clear through line graphic here. You can kind of see the idea. The idea here is that you start with sort of this buyer's problem. Based on that problem, you sort of unpack it and provide guidance on the solution. But then you take that further, right? You associate that problem with a solution category, basically a category of products or services in which you operate. And then you sort of take that all the way through to, here's how we address this specific problem. So if you think about sort of the construction of a blog post, let's say, the ideal scenario would be you are covering this entire expanse, right? You are starting with the problem, you're walking the reader through the problem, you're exposing sort of the solution, and then you're sort of pitching your business as the product or service to help them solve that problem. Okay, now the reason why this is important, of course, first and foremost, is because you're sort of getting an at bat, right? Anybody who does happen to land on your website, through Google or wherever else, you're getting sort of an at bat to pitch them the product. Now, depending on your space, maybe nobody ever is going to buy off the back of one sort of top of the funnel blog post. That's a real reality in many industries and for many businesses. But the point being is that, like, you've still sort of constructed the narrative in their mind if they're actually reading this content directly. But the other piece of this is that from an AEO perspective, this is super important for you, even as a solo founder, a solopreneur, is that you are associating your brand, your product, your service with the specific problems. And so that's why we call this problem anchoring, is because the idea is that when these conversations are happening in ChatGPT, a lot of times they are starting with those types of queries that would have previously been sort of top of the funnel types of search keywords, right? So again, how do I speed up my procurement or whatever? That chat is now happening in ChatGPT, and the effect that you can have as a business on that is, one, you can earn citations, right? So if you're writing authoritative content about that particular problem, you are potentially owning citations within that response. Secondly, you have a chance to kind of impact the narrative, or impact the actual response and the narrative that the LLMs are putting out there, right? So if you have laid out a very clear vision or a very clear narrative of, here's the problem, here's the solution, here's the product to buy, that at least gives you an opportunity to influence those LLM responses. Now, publishing one blog post is probably not going to change ChatGPT's mind, but the point being is that over time, what you're doing is you're building authority, you're anchoring your problem and solution, and also keeping in mind that these conversations are not static. It's not a single prompt that people are putting into ChatGPT, and then they like go on their day. A lot of times it's like a very nuanced discovery type of conversation. It starts with the problem, it moves into like more solution oriented questions, and then it ultimately moves maybe to, okay, compare this solution versus that solution. So the idea again is that you're anchoring your brand within that context, within that conversation, and hopefully you sort of have an opportunity there to show up as that person progresses through their own purchasing journey, even if that's happening entirely within ChatGPT or an LLM. Okay, so that's problem anchoring. So all the way back to your initial question here, Mayor. I think those are kind of the priority order things. When you get to this content coverage question, is there sort of an infinite number of pieces of content that you could create? Yes, in theory, but realistically, for a lot of companies, you want to own a universe of topics that are sort of most closely related to your brand, product, or service. So I would focus on building that library and then maintaining that library, right? So rather than just continuing to pump out content forever, I think a lot of, or an increasing focus for solopreneurs, and also honestly for every business, is building and maintaining the library of high value, most relevant content rather than just churning out a new blog post every week, right? So um, that's the approach there. And then I would say, the long tail of this is like offsite stuff. We'll talk a little bit about that here in a couple on a couple other questions. But yeah, I think my general recommendation for anyone is sort of start with the things that you can control. All right, let's go to the next question. This question comes to us from our friend Emily at CoSchedule. Emily asked, basically, how should we be tracking AEO at this point? There have been some shifts and changes in this, and frankly, it's not always like sort of a reliable. There's not always a reliable source of data to tell us, how are we performing from an AEO perspective, and more importantly, what impact is that having on the business. So I've got actually like I think 3 slides worth of things to talk through on this one. So we'll try to keep it as short and sweet as possible, but the answer is a little bit nuanced. Um, the first thing to know is that there is a new channel group in GA4 called AI Assistants. So Google's trying to kind of throw us a bone here in terms of like understanding the impact. This channel group basically replaces like some of the manual segments that people have been creating, and it aggregates referral traffic from LLMs. So what this is tracking is, again, just sort of purely referral traffic. Somebody sees a link to your website in a ChatGPT response, they click that link, they come to your website, they are allowing cookies, all that good stuff. Are some assumptions there, but the point being is that it's telling you a directional measure of how much referral traffic you're getting from directly from these LLMs. It covers, as far as I know, it covers at least Claude, ChatGPT, and Gemini. But the full list of included sources is not 100% clear. So first and foremost, I don't know. I don't think it's covering any other kind of the long tail of other models, like for example, Perplexity. I don't believe is being aggregated into this channel group. I could be wrong about that. And then the other thing to know is that the referral source, like the actual URL that shows up as a referral, is sometimes a little variable. Sometimes there's a little static in the data. So it's not a perfect measurement. It's certainly not perfect, but it does replace sort of the need to go in and create like a manual segment or create a manual filter. For example, we had been doing that for a long time where we just had like a big regex filter that we would run to try to build reports specifically for traffic coming from these sources. So it does make it a little easier. Can you trust it? Is perhaps the next question. The short answer is no. In terms of like really measuring and understanding AI traffic or AI influence, let's say, on your business, it's not going to give you the full picture for myriad reasons, which you probably know. We'll get into this on the next slide. But the key thing here is like this is definitely not a perfect measurement. It's not giving you the full picture, even in terms of like referral traffic. It's probably not giving you the full picture. But more importantly, referral traffic, as you probably know, is only a drop in the bucket of like the overall influence of AI on your business. And so that brings us to this next point, which is AI referral traffic versus total impact. So this is a chart that I just saw float across my feed this week, which I think is very valuable and sort of instructional and perhaps a good like benchmark to use internally. for some companies at least. So this data comes from Graphite, and it is actually from N8N. So if you're familiar with N8N, it's sort of like a more complex version of Zapier, I would say. Anyway, it's a workflow tool. The point being is that N8N measured their GA4 referral traffic conversions versus self-reported sources of conversions, and they found about a 10x discrepancy. So what that means is that about 10 times more customers said they came from an LLM versus what they could actually measure in GA4 from referral traffic alone. Okay, so this is, again, I think instructive. It kind of gives us at least like a scale or like a magnitude. It's not going to be the same for every business, of course, but in general, you might use as a benchmark, say, hey, our referral traffic represents about 10% of the actual impact that AI is having on our business, or is driving the results it's driving for our business. Okay, so that's going to give you, again, kind of a benchmark. Hopefully, and I'm sure it will happen. There will be more data like this that comes out, and maybe we'll even get some sort of industry wide benchmarks that we can start to use as like a directional barometer. But I think for now, it's a probably a pretty fair and safe assumption, at least from the data that I've seen, the clients that we work with. I don't think this is out of the realm of reality, right? I think the self attribution that's coming through on these conversions is, of course, in and of itself not perfect, but it gives us something to kind of peg our numbers around. So that's the one thing that I would think about here in terms of how to measure AI and LLM impact. The next thing is, there's sort of a long tail here of other like directional measures. Let's say. So obviously, we just talked about the self-reported attribution. There's also correlated growth in AI visibility versus other sort of buckets of traffic, if you will. So this is some data that we had from a client that we're working on, and you can see here basically what we're looking at here is that as the AI mention rate and citation rate increased, there was a correlated increase with direct traffic. Now, this is not a sophisticated correlation study. This is just like sort of an eyeball correlation. But we have seen this type of trend across many companies and clients that we've worked with, which is that as your AI visibility increases, you generally see an increase in direct traffic, branded search, and traffic to your homepage. Again, imperfect measurement, correlation at best, certainly not pure causation. So, data nerds, please put away your pitchforks. Don't come for me in the comments. But again, as sort of a way to correlate, apologies, my phone's ringing, as a way to correlate your efforts with potential impact. This does give you another sort of lever. So what we tend to do with our clients is we look at sort of a buffet of metrics. So we start with sort of the stuff that we can measure most concretely. In most cases, that's referral traffic to leads, to conversions, to revenue, whatever sort of metric we can get to. Then we sort of use that as sort of a baseline. In some cases, we're extrapolating that to say, okay, here's what we sort of estimate as like kind of the full impact based on what we've seen with other clients. And then we're also usually reporting on sort of the side by side kind of correlation here. So directionally speaking, as we have worked together and we've improved your visibility, here's what we're seeing in terms of these increase in direct traffic or branded search traffic to the homepage. Imperfect, again, just to restate the obvious, but it does give us a couple different ways to kind of triangulate the full impact to the best of our abilities and with the data that we have. So yeah, I guess to go back to your question, Emily. There are, I think the through line here, like the actual measurement, I think is fairly reliable for what it is. I don't think that the sort of underlying methodology has changed significantly. Although there have been some changes in the models, hey, sometimes they're including more citations and other times they're including less citations. If there are significant changes in the model, for example, that like make the links more prominent in citations, that might affect that like 10x or 10% kind of calculation if that's baked into your measurement. But otherwise, I haven't seen a lot of evidence that sort of the fundamental or like underlying data that is being tracked through these sources is has changed significantly. That's been my experience. Okay, next question. Okay, so this is a question that came from a call that I had this week. Have you had any success just building your own list on your website? Right. So basically, this person was asking me about what you might call self promotional listicles. Okay, so this again has been a topic of debate, pro con, over the last several months or years, perhaps. But basically, the question is like, should I go out and create a bunch of best procurement software lists and put myself number one? And is that going to affect my AEO or my AI visibility? The short answer is yes, it works. Okay. I don't think there's any debate about that. Like, it works. Whether it will work forever or for how long it will work or to what extent it works, there are a lot of factors and variables that go into that. But the short answer is yes, it generally is effective at both improving your SEO visibility as well as your AI visibility. The reason for that is, of course, that AI is surfacing information from a variety of sources, and so if you sort of get your hat in the ring and say, hey, no, actually, when you're answering prompts about this category, like, we're number one, or we are at least on the list, you sort of have like a tiny bit of influence at least on that response. So is publishing one listicle going to skyrocket your AI visibility tomorrow? Probably not. But realistically, we do know that this works. We've seen it time and time again. I can tell you explicitly that it has worked. It works for us. We use this strategy on our website, and we have seen it work. And in fact, this article that I'm going to talk about here in just a moment with Lily Ray uses us as an example. But it does work. Yes, 100% works. So that being said, there are several caveats here. So some things that you should at least be aware of and probably mindful of. Number one is it's really not just like pure self promotion. So a lot of people look at these lists and they say, "Oh my God, you wrote a list and you put yourself as number one. That's so fake." Like, blah blah. Of course, first of all, of course, you put yourself as number one. First of all, nothing even says it has to be a ranking, right? Like, if you say these are the best 10 procurement software solutions, you have to put them in an order of some sort. But nothing says that you have to say, hey, we are explicitly the best. You can just say we are the first option we're putting on this list, right? That's a totally fair way to frame things. Secondly, beyond just like pure self promotion and trying to sort of influence the list that is being generated via LLMs, there's also sort of these other effects that we should be thinking about. So, sort of similar to like the problem anchoring that we were talking about in the first question, we think about this idea of like category ownership and like solution clarity. So basically, the premise is this: if you, let's say you're us, okay, so we do both SEO and GEO or AEO or whatever you want to call it. If somebody says what's the best SEO agency, and we have a list that's 10 best SEO agencies, then we're more likely to show up in the response. But B, if somebody goes to ChatGPT and asks the same question, but they say who's the best AEO agency, and we do not have a list there, now we've sort of missed our opportunity to influence that response, right? So ChatGPT is going to make, or any LLM is going to make some associations between your brand, the entity that is your brand, and the entity that is specific product categories. Okay, so when somebody goes into an LLM and they ask, who's the best X, Y, and Z, it's going to look through sort of these entity associations and kind of figure out which brands are most closely associated with the entity of that category. That's a very my layman's understanding, at least, of how it works. I'm not a data scientist. I'm not an AI engineer. So again, don't come for me in the comments. But the point here is that if you don't sort of anchor your brand to all of the categories in which you operate, then you probably won't show up in those lists, right? That's the basic outcome from this, is that having these lists, and in many cases having multiple lists that sort of position you within a few different categories in which you should belong, is going to have sort of a compounding effect, right? So when people are searching for categories using different language or slightly different categories in which you operate as a business, you would ideally want to show up there. So it's not just pure self promotion, it's also about sort of training the LLMs to associate your brand with specific categories. Okay, that is an important piece of this. I think it is valuable, and you should likely pursue a strategy that includes that as at least one lever. Um, but here's the big caveat, and here's the article here that has maybe been drawing your eye here from Lily Ray. Do not abuse this strategy. It will and or it can and likely will backfire perhaps catastrophically. Okay. So, first and foremost, stick to the categories in which you legitimately operate or the categories in which you legitimately compete. Do not fire off 1,000 of these listicles and try to wedge your way into every category under the sun. Bad idea in general. I just, yeah, I won't go into all the details, but I would not recommend you do that. Don't go ham on your competitors, for lack of a better term. Again, there are many ways that you can frame this. It doesn't have to be like a hit piece on every competitor in your space. So, be mindful about how you're talking about your competitors. Readers are humans, right? So anybody who's reading the content, you want them to sort of believe the things that you're saying first and foremost. But secondly, to whatever extent that messaging gets pulled through to like an LLM response, like you also want that to be like believable and stuff. So, be sort of mindful of how you position yourself versus your competitors. I would say be sort of respectful, I guess is maybe the best way I can frame it. The third thing I'll say is be careful about cannibalization. So cannibalization meaning you're going after a bunch of variations of essentially the same category. That's a bad strategy for a number of reasons, but the number one reason is that it sort of cannibalizes your SEO, right? So, for example, procurement software versus procurement tool versus procurement solution or whatever, right? Like that is likely one category. You don't need to create 3 different pages to pursue each of those specific terms or categories. So, being mindful of that, there's some ways that you can kind of parse those out and really figure out like where is the line, what sort of merits its own page or constitutes a standalone category that I should actually target. But the point there is, you have to be mindful about that. If you just go out there and start flinging these things off the shelf, you will likely run into issues down the line, if not potentially catastrophic consequences. To wit, Lily Ray's post here is also a good reminder. So this is actually back from February. There was a big, Google core update where Google essentially seems to have really cracked down on these self-promotional listicles. I won't go through all of the data that Lily presents in this article, but the upshot is this: they seem to have specifically targeted companies that abused this strategy, meaning, many of them had dozens or hundreds or even thousands of these lists on their website. Again, they sort of violated all of these rules that I just told you not to violate. They went after every category under the sun. They, made 100 different variations of the same category to try to kind of juice the rankings across the board, et cetera, et cetera. So, again, short answer is yeah, this stuff works whether we like it or not. Right now, this works. I think there's like a very white hat version of this, and it's a spectrum from there all the way to sort of the most black hat version imaginable. But I do think it is a valuable strategy. I think done correctly, executed well. There's value in doing this. I definitely think so. That's my experience. Okay, next question. I am missing a visual here. Sorry about that. How much of AEO can we control directly versus offsite or off-page factors? Okay, so this is a big question. Again, I would characterize this as a hot debate in the AEO SEO nerd circles, perhaps. So yeah, we're gonna get into it. This is my opinion. This is my experience. Different people have different experiences, I am sure. As with all things, right, it depends. As with all things marketing, I should say, it depends. The key thing in my experience here is to start by assessing where you are right now as a brand. What is your AI visibility? But more importantly, what are the underlying factors that are driving your current visibility, and what are the gaps that are open for you to improve your visibility right now. Okay, so as I mentioned, I think in the first question, I went a little bit on a tangent there, but the main thing to know is that it's a different starting point for every brand, and it really depends on where you're at as to which factors are most likely to influence your AI visibility and which levers are going to be most important in terms of prioritization. Okay, so some questions to think about to sort of assess where you are now. How clear and consistent is your brand across the properties that you control? We already talked about this idea of like brand messaging and consistency, super important. I think one of the most overlooked components here, in my opinion. Number two, how clearly defined is your positioning in the market versus competitors? So again, going back to like the idea of positioning content, like do we have a clear position in the market? Have we very clearly articulated that? Do LLMs understand it? Right? How well do LLMs understand your features and functionality? Another big gap for a lot of companies, specifically in our space, B2B tech and SaaS. Uh, the messaging on many SaaS websites is not always crystal clear. Obviously we tend to be uh, anchor our messaging to benefits, which is great. But when it comes down to making buying decisions, a lot of people want to know sort of the nuts and bolts of what does this thing actually do? Does it do this? Does it work with this type of file? Can I export it to this tool? Whatever, right? There are a lot of like functional questions that many companies do not have the content to answer on their website. And so therefore it is generally unknown to LLMs, and also creates the potential that LLMs hallucinate or make up functionality in order to answer user questions about your product. So understanding how well LLMs actually understand the features and functionality of your product or your business is very important. And then, how complete is your coverage of sort of the core topics that you should own? That goes back to the idea of like topical coverage that we talked about before, and like this idea of problem anchoring and like category ownership and like solution clarity and all this stuff, right? All of that is basically being derived from the corpus of content that is primarily on your website. Not only, not, obviously LLMs are synthesizing information from many different sources and from their own training, their entire training corpus. But as a brand, you obviously have a specific amount of control or total control over the content on your website, and so making sure that you have at least the coverage there, if not like super great content that sort of answers all the questions and checks all the boxes and applies all the best practices and all that stuff, is another key question to ask here. Okay, so when we work with a client, the first thing that we do during the strategy process is we sort of assess their business across all of these different dimensions. And so what that tells us is basically like, again, what is the priority here? What are the actual gaps that we should fill? And what's the work that needs to be done? Interestingly, there's sort of a reverse correlation here between like sort of the size of the company and like the amount of influence that you have on your website directly, right? So let's say you're an established business, maybe you've been around for a few years, but you're invisible in AI. Chances are, you already have a footprint across the web. People are talking about you, but you're not really leveraging that footprint because of these factors that you control, right? Like you don't have good content on your website, your messaging is not clear, your brand is inconsistent, right? These factors tend to be more likely influential if you have sort of an existing footprint, right? If you're starting from square one today, right, then those off-page factors are perhaps more of an immediate priority. And again, this is my experience, but it also depends on the industry and what your competitors look like. Do they have a big footprint? How mature is the category that you're operating in, right? There's a lot of factors, right? And so there is no one size fits all roadmap to achieving AI dominance. Okay. A lot of people, I think, want that. They want me to sit down and say, okay, just do A, then do B, then do C. Yes, that is the goal, and that is what we work with clients to develop, is that specific roadmap for their specific brand, but it's based on the analysis of all these other factors. So it's not something that I can just dictate to anyone and it will work for every brand, because everyone's in a different place. Everyone has a different footprint. Everyone has a different catalog of existing content or no existing content or landing product and feature pages that are very clear or very not clear. So all of those factors are sort of rolled up into this question of how much AEO can we control directly versus offsite. Um, I can't give you one specific answer, but I can tell you that based on my experience, first of all, I am slightly biased. We focus entirely on page stuff, right? So content strategy, messaging, consistency, clarity, that kind of stuff across the properties that you own and control as a brand. That is our focus. We don't do Reddit or any of this other stuff to try to influence LLMs outside of your website. So bias, full transparency there, but that being said, we have seen, I would say, tremendous results from our own from applying this framework to our clients and working with them to sort of clean up their own house, right? First and foremost, in order to really drive that improved AI visibility. So, in many cases, we have seen 20 to 50% improvement in terms of like brand recommendations and the sort of citation rate, AI visibility, as like an aggregate metric. Before we even think about off page. So I would say, unless you really feel like you're sort of really spick and span and everything on your website is as good as it's going to get, and you've really checked all of the other boxes, in my personal opinion, the off page stuff that is a harder to influence and b I would characterize it as a slightly murkier. Um, uh, I would basically push that down the prioritization list in most cases. But that being said, yeah, if we get a client that comes to us tomorrow and I say, hey, look, everything on your website is perfect, you've done everything exactly right, and you are still losing to a competitor, then yeah, I mean, it comes down to basically your footprint, right? It's sort of similar to how we've approached SEO for years, right? Which is like, do links matter? Yes, of course. The links to your website are a factor in your SEO ranking. Is it like the number one thing and the most important thing and the thing that every company should do right away? Probably not. It's generally more of a tactical, targeted approach to win specific queries or to outrank specific competitors in specific contexts. I kind of think about it in the same way for AEO. I think it's a measured and a targeted tool that you can deploy in specific contexts, but it's probably not going to be the fix for every brand. And certainly the brands that I've talked to, there's a lot of work to do on the website first and foremost. So that's usually where we're focusing. All right. Those are my questions that I have for today. I'm going to pop over to LinkedIn really quick and just see if we're getting any questions here. In the meantime, I just want to say if you have not already signed up, go to yesoptimist.com/office. Uh, I might have left the old date, today's date on there. We haven't scheduled the next one of these organic office hours, but we will be scheduling another one. So if you would like to receive email notifications about the next session, please go to yesoptimist.com/office. You can sign up via email and you will get notifications about those upcoming sessions. Okay. Is this live? Yes, no, this is live. Okay, so I'm just looking here at the questions to see if there are any. Okay, I do not see any questions on the live stream. No worries. But hey, Noah, good to see you. Yes, I should check out the MF Doom mask live at the Museum of Pop Culture in Seattle. That sounds pretty cool. Um, anyway, okay, well, I will wrap things up there then. If you do have questions, once again, first of all, pop them in the chat here on this session. Send them to me via DM, send them to me via email, however you want to reach out to me. Please send me your questions. I would love to answer them on an upcoming session of Organic Office Hours. And if you would like to remain anonymous or submit a question and you don't want your identity disclosed on the stream, that's totally fine as well. Just let me know and I can make that happen. All right, my friends. Well, that's it for me today. Happy Friday to y'all. I hope you have a great weekend. Yeah, thanks for being here.